Hola, bienvenidos! In today's video, we're going to go over indirect object pronouns in Spanish. Let's take a look. Alright, let's start by defining indirect objects. Now, when you're learning a language, you need to understand the different parts of speech that exist. So not only what their names are, but what their function is in a sentence. If you understand their role, then you should be able to use those items more easily. So let's break down the sentence. I speak Spanish to her every day. Now, I is the subject. It's what does the action. So who's doing the speaking? I. That would be your subject. Speak is our verb, so it's our action word. Spanish. That's our direct object. You might have heard of these before. So that's what receives the action. So in this case, what is being spoken? Spanish. Then we've got to her. This is the part we want to focus on for indirect objects because to her is the indirect object. What's the definition of that? To or for whom the action is done. So to whom is Spanish spoken? To her. So she is the indirect object, to her. And then lastly, we've got our frequency every day. In Spanish, you might actually have already seen indirect objects if you've studied the verb gustar, because they appear with that verb actually. So at the start of a sentence that uses gusta, a, and then either a noun, a pronoun, or a name, that's actually the indirect object because you're saying to whom something is pleasing. So for example, we've got a ella here, which would be a pronoun example. We could say something like al chico, so to the boy, a él, to him, that would be pronoun, and then a Paco, to Paco. So all of these are examples of how to form an indirect object in Spanish. We have a, because we're saying to or for whom, and then the actual person. Just be aware on the pronoun front that if you want to say to me or to you, that's slightly different. We say a mí, con acento, a ti, no accent. So now that we have defined what an indirect object is, let's move on to indirect object pronouns. Now these pronouns are unique because they can either replace or accompany the indirect object. We know pronouns in general replace nouns. These ones can either replace or accompany the indirect object. So for example, if you've studied correr, le gusta correr, this le would be an indirect object pronoun. Because that's such a mouthful, you might see IOP for short or IOP if you say it as a word. Now, we base it again off the indirect object. So if we've got a ella, when you conjugate, would be found in this box down here. So we would choose the same IOP from this box to get to or for her, which is what this says. So to say to or for me, we have me. To or for you, te. To or for him, her, or it could be you, formal like usted, le. To or for us, nos. To or for y'all, os, remember that would be in Spain for vosotros. To or for them, les, and that also includes ustedes for lace as well. So how do you choose the indirect object pronoun, the IOP? Again, you think to yourself, okay, what was my indirect object? To whom or for whom is this action being done? Then you find the corresponding box on this chart. So if I say this action is for us, okay, I'm going to choose nos. If it's for him or her, I'll choose le. If it's for you, singular and formal, I'll choose te. And that's how you find your IOP, or indirect object pronoun. Now something worth noting here is like this definition at the top says, this IOP can either replace the indirect object, so you're using it instead of it, or you can use both the indirect object and the IOP. What would that look like? Well, in this example here, there's both. You've got your indirect object a ella and your IOP, le. Or you can choose just to use the IOP. So in this case, le is used. There's no indirect object before it. Why would you have the IOP versus the IOP and the indirect object? Well, the rule of thumb I tell my students is generally, if you're using an IOP from up here, the top half of the chart, you don't need to use this indirect object because it's clear who this person is. Me, te, nos, and os, there's no question who those belong to. Maybe for emphasis you could include it, but it's not super necessary. However, if you just randomly throw a sentence out that uses le or lace, for example, le gusta correr, without any other information, we're going to have some trouble understanding that, because le could be 3 different things. Lace could be 2 different things. So if you're just writing a singular sentence without any other context clues or additional information around it, and you're using an IOP from this last row, lay or lace, then it's probably a good idea to think about adding in the indirect object. So like Paco, for example. So that way we clarify who this lay is referring to. Of course, maybe you write a previous sentence that says, oh, Paco runs a lot. Then we can imply that, oh, that lay belongs to Paco. We've got other contextual clues to help us. So just keep that in mind as you're writing these sentences. When could you include an indirect object versus just using the IOP? Now for these IOPs, where do they go in a sentence? Well, if you've seen other pronouns like reflexive pronouns, direct object pronouns, you'll notice that the rules are the same. So the most common one to be aware of is sentences with a conjugative verb. To have a sentence, you have to have a conjugative verb, or else you don't have a sentence in Spanish. So, te hablo español mucho. I speak Spanish to you a lot. So hablo is conjugated, so the te, the IOP, is before it. Now this situation will happen almost every single time you've got a sentence, because again, if it's a sentence, there will be a conjugative verb. So if you're familiar with this first rule, you'll be in really good shape. What about if you want to spice up your sentences a little, make them more complex and sophisticated? Well, if at any point in that sentence there's an infinitive and you're trying to use an IOP, an IOP, you can actually attach it to the end of the infinitive, all one word. So, quiero ofrecerle parte de mi almuerzo a él. Now, ofrecer, again, is an infinitive. Le would be our IOP, so the two are connected as a single word. I want to offer part of my lunch to him. We know the le refers to him because of the indirect object also being included. We could also attach to a gerund. A gerund is just a fancy way to say the ing form of a verb. And we need to add an accent when this happens. So for example, está escribiéndonos una carta. So this person is writing a letter to us. To or for whom is the action being done? To us. The letter's going to us. So that's your indirect object. It's attached right to the end of the ing form, so escribiendo for this IR verb. You'll notice that on yendo, the E gets an accent mark if you attach. If you had an AR verb like hablando, for example, the accent would go over the A in ando, only when we attach like so. And lastly, if we use any affirmative commands, so that means you're telling someone to do something. So if I say, do your homework, do your homework is an affirmative command. I'm telling someone to do something. Now, in this case, I'm saying tell the truth to them. So because I'm giving a positive command, I'm telling someone to do something. Anytime that happens that a pronoun is involved, like a direct object pronoun, indirect, or reflexive, it must be attached. You don't have an option. So you would say diles la verdad a ellos. So it gets tacked on right to the end. Just be aware also that when you're dealing with affirmative commands and attaching pronouns, there are punctuation rules with accent marks that need to be taken into account, and you can check out our other videos to see how those work. But in general, if you've got an affirmative command, IOPs get tacked right on if they're applicable to that sentence. Alright, and that's the basics with indirect object pronouns. So things to remember. What is an indirect object? You need to know that definition. An indirect object is to whom or for whom the action is being done in a sentence. Of course, not all sentences have one, just like when you learn direct objects, so you got to watch out for that. You need to memorize your IOPs, your IOPs, your indirect object pronouns, the me, te, le, nos, os, les. You've used them with gustar probably before. Where can those go in a sentence? That's another piece that takes practice and time to get used to. But once you master these, oh my gosh, your sentences will become so much more sophisticated when you speak and you write. So it's worth the time to put in this effort. Thanks for watching. I hope this was helpful. Buena suerte y nos vemos.